Dr. Kathryn Bond Stockton, or KBS as I call you.
KBS.
Thank you for being here. Welcome. We're going to talk about gender, queerness, and identity through the eyes of children and also the adults raising them, myself included. But I want to introduce you more formally. So Kathryn Bond Stockton is a distinguished professor of English, former associate vice president for equity and diversity, where you and I met.
You bet.
That's about over 12 years ago?
Yeah, I think I started in 2014.
2014. Yeah. Wow. You're a former inaugural dean of the School for Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah, where you teach queer theory, theories of race and racialized gender, and 20th century literature and film. Two of your books, Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shame, were Black Meets Queer, and The Queer Child were national finalists for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBT Studies. In addition, your recent book, Making Out, was a 2020 national finalist for the Next Generation Indie Book Award for memoir. Your newest book is entitled Genders, which I have here. And let's see, you have also authored God Between Their Lips. You have taught at Cornell University School of Criticism and Theory, and along with your University Top Teaching Award, you've received the Utah Allies Award for LGBT activism, the Now Lifetime Achievement Award, the YWCA Outstanding Achievement Award in Arts and Communication, the Crompton Knoll Prize for Best Essay in Gay and Lesbian Studies from the Modern Language Association, and the Rosenblatt Prize for Excellence. This is the highest honor granted by the University of Utah. I read your CV. Awards on awards on awards on awards, and then the publishing. And I mean, you're just this big, impactful person in our world. And I have the honor to know you even outside of that.
It's funny, I was going to say that exactly about you.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
I think this is a mirrored exchange.
I love it.
Yeah.
Because I've had the opportunity to see you in your most vulnerable moments.
Yes.
I have had the opportunities to see you lead through the most trying times. I've had the opportunity to brainstorm with you, to create with you. I mean, so I've seen you outside of all of these awards and accolades, and you're something else. I've learned so much from you. I mean, I can go on and we can have a whole podcast about how much you've impacted my life.
Just talk about all the fun that we've had and the fiery moments at our jobs.
This means a lot to me that you're here talking with me. And I think what's really interesting, because now in this phase of my life, I'm raising a 5-year-old. Yeah. Ayan. And what is really wild is that I'm trying to understand his world. And in order for me to access his world, I have to kind of undo mine at the same time. Yeah. And a lot of that has been a day-to-day thing, sometimes minute-to-minute thing.
Right.
And so this is really important to me because we are exploring gender identity within my household. And identity in general. And I just find myself going back to my upbringing and the things that I was taught and the things that I subscribed to, all the social constructs.
Right.
And I there's just a lot of undoing.
Yes.
There's a lot of therapy and a lot of undoing there.
Yeah.
So my first question to you is, tell us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing, and then how you sort of started to understand your own identity and then gender more broadly. How did you come to understand gender more broadly in the ways that you do now?
Well, first of all, cool that Ayan has a deeply curious parent in you.
Trying to be.
And I'm sure also in your partner as well. I mean, that's such a huge thing for any child who may be on an exploratory path, and what child isn't? Yeah. So one of my fundamental points is that gender and childhood are really strange for everyone. We are all in this strange sea of received wisdom that may strike us as right or may strike us as wrong or fitting us or not fitting us along the way. And I don't think that anybody can live the ideals of gender, that pretend to be ideal, right? That these norms are given to all of us. And another really key thought throughout my work is that gender norms, at least in this country, have tended to be white gender norms. So that's another thing that we have to deal with. And we'll probably keep coming back and in and out of questions of racialization and money that so profoundly are in the mix of gender.
Yeah.
All right. So for my story, I was undeniably a queer child in very particular ways. And again, aren't we all? But I think for me, the thing that was really striking, I always say that there were two things that I knew by the age of 6, that I wanted to kiss girls' lips and I wanted to kiss the boy word in relation to myself, meaning I felt myself to be a boy. I wanted to be addressed as a boy, considered a boy, called a boy in a way that I could own that word for myself. So I think what's interesting about me is it's not clear, was there a chicken or an egg? People often ask me that. Do you think one thing drove the other thing? And I literally don't know, because I wanted to kiss girls. Did I think I must be a boy because only boys kiss girls, in my imagination as a child? Yeah. Or, did it go the other way? Because I feel myself to be a boy, of course I'll kiss girls. Or was this not a chicken or an egg? There's no chicken or eggness in this. Yeah. These two facts are just true about me, running as parallel things in my childhood.
Is that what, when you were 6? Is that what it just
by
sort of came?
Six. By six,
okay,
I know I felt this way. I actually pretty certain I felt both of those things at about 3.5, at least by 3.5, because I was born in Columbus, Ohio. So we were living in Ohio. And I absolutely remember having a big crush on the girl next door. Again, any younger child could have a crush, on an older girl. But it felt really, that just felt like the most natural thing in the world to me. And already I absolutely felt myself to be a boy and could not understand why I had to be called a girl and had to keep presenting as a girl. Yeah. So that's by 3.5, because those memories are so palpable from that time. And then we moved to Connecticut. So it's interesting how place, right, can anchor memories. I could be wrong, but I highly doubt it, because the memories seem very vibrant and very precise. Yeah. So I'm being kind of generous temporally to say that by the age of 6, for sure, I knew these things. And one of the things I write about in my book, Making Out, which is, yes, a book about kissing, but it's also a book about reading and making meaning, like making things out. How do I make out the gender that I am, or how do I make out, propensities of someone that I wish to love? So making out means many things in that book. Yeah. But I have a little section called Hollywood Kiss at Age 6. And in that section, I try to tell the story of why it was I wanted to have a Hollywood kiss from my mother. Okay. And what I think is so interesting is realizing, to me, this is a very important realization in memory, because it tells us that kids, of course, see kissing and probably think about kissing from a very young age. Yeah. They see it. Yeah. It's not censored from view. They can do it too. They can kiss a whole range of people. But as we know, kisses are on a continuum from kind of very breezy, friendly to very sexual. Yeah. And kids see kissing in the cinema. Yeah. And clearly I had seen kissing in the cinema because I was thinking of this genre of the Hollywood kiss. Yeah. And what I meant by that was, the type of romantic kiss you see on the Hollywood screen. Yeah. And you could say, well, why was a seeming little girl, wanting a Hollywood kiss with her mother? Well, I know that for me, I felt like if I can get that kiss, it proves I am a boy. Now, I did adore my mother, so it was also about loving her. Yeah. But I think it was so much, too, about confirming my own gendering. Yeah. So here, once again, we see that gendering and sexuality are going together in an interesting way, or not running on fully separable rails. Again, they might in some cases, but for me, they kept colliding. So in that sense, I thought if I can just get this kiss, my problems will be solved. And I'm not sure that I ever did get that kiss.
Did you talk to your mom about this? Like, did you ever bring it up to her?
I really need, she's read my book, and we never talked about that particular part of it. Yeah. But I should go back and say to her, do you remember me asking for that? Was that anything that you have in your memory whatsoever? Because it was so profound to me. Yeah. Yeah. And what it tells me, too, is just how desperately by age 6, I was feeling that I cannot be this thing that I want to be. And I think it must be very hard for people who haven't felt that, who felt some deep-seated comfort with what they were assigned. They haven't chafed against it. Now, look, I'm sure everybody has, right?
Yeah.
And then most profoundly, surface presentation. So I think this is probably key in what we have to talk about. Where does that urge come from to want to present with what I have come to call boy surface, for lack of a better term? Because again, I don't know what it means to think like a boy, because how would we ever measure that for anybody?
No.
Just take any boy who feels, normatively like a boy, is trying to live the gender ideals of boyhood, God bless them, but say they're trying to do that, right? I mean, we don't know how that boy feels, and we don't know how that boy feels relative to another boy, seemingly normative boy. So this is a very complicated thing. Yeah. But I think what we can agree on is there's certain types of surface presentation that by tradition and association, we would say look boyish, if we were sighted people and seeing somebody. Yeah. So I wanted that surface presentation. And the thing that I'm not sure about, I don't think anybody ever has to account for the why. I think the longest time gay people were presented with this question: why are you gay? Well, why are you straight? Or, so these are questions that I don't think anybody ever has to answer. No. But in writing Making Out, I wanted to enter into the deep-seated mystery of it all. Yeah. And just kind of wonder out loud about myself, about nobody else but myself. Yeah. And I wasn't sure, was it that I wanted to move like a boy? I was very sporty, and in that period of time, girls not allowed to play Little League baseball. There's no girls soccer. If you're going outdoors and playing, you're probably being called a tomboy at the very least, which surely did not hurt my feelings. At least boy is in that phrase, tomboy, Yeah. So I wanted to move in certain ways. Did I want certain privileges that I saw coming with the word boy? And let's be true, white boy. I had an older brother, 4 years older. Did I see things that he was getting to do that I wasn't getting to do, and therefore I want to be a boy? Could be. Or was it some sort of deep, mysterious aesthetic attraction that I had to that boy surface for myself? And yet, of course, very attracted to girl surface in girls. Yeah. I was not attracted to boyish girls. I was attracted to seemingly normatively feminine girls. Yeah. So I think the question of why, even for those of us who go looking for it with a spirit of generosity towards ourselves, it's very hard to get to the bottom of that. And of course, nobody really talks about the racialized histories of the terms boy and girl, at least not in white suburban life. Maybe in other places and other families, that becomes a conversation early on. But whiteness has stoppered that and makes us keep pretending that there are two sexes, male and female, boy and girl. And historically in these United States, that has not been true.
No. As you were talking, I was thinking about the limitations. So you're finding and you call it surface.
Boy surface.
Boy surface. You're finding these things to either affirm what you're feeling, and it's not quite the thing. It's not quite there, but it's close enough. Or it's these things, and there's not. And the way we're socially constructed is that binary. So how would you even account for all the in-betweens of this binary? How could you even account for that? Yeah. That to me is, I'm just thinking a lot about that, especially when I think about Ion and all the little kids. They, to see a Hollywood kiss or to see a Disney movie or to watch watch their grown-ups and how they interact. And it's all very limiting. Yeah. If that is what you're going, that's all you have to go off of. Yes.
I often say, in my period, we were two-word children, right? There's boy and there's girl. And everything else in your life has to kind of snake around these two terms, the kind of the murderousness of trying to force yourself. And then for me, I couldn't ditch the one word, but I couldn't get the other word. So as I always say, I was falling in between them and impaled upon both. Yeah. So I was really not girl, not boy, was sort of the way that I was rolling because nobody's giving me the boy word. Actually, I had some boys in my neighborhood, two boys that I was very close to, one my own age and one 3 years younger. And they did kind of accord me that status. I mean, I couldn't x-ray their head, so who knows what they were really thinking.
Yeah.
But when we played together and I picked a boy name for myself and they would call me that name.
How did that feel?
I would dress amazing.
Yeah.
I often say, you know, I was a girl by day and a boy by night. I think this is another thing we don't talk about is the weird temporality of childhood. Now, again, a lot of people would know this through their labor. They're one person during the day, another person at night.
Right, the code switching.
You're racialized one way during the day at work. You come home into your family unit. You feel racialized in a different way.
Yep.
So there's so many things to say about this. But when it comes to gender, that line can be so dramatic. And in my time, you had to dress as a girl at school. So I had to go in skirts always.
Okay, like a uniform.
Well, it wasn't even a uniform. This is just in public school. You are required to dress that way in my time period. I don't know what would have happened if we tried to buck it. It probably wasn't an actual law, but it was such a deep-seated norm.
Yeah, no one would want to go against it.
I never saw anybody buck that, you know, all through elementary school. Yeah. And so I tried to be a boy at recess and was often received that way, again, by other boys, though there I am, a boy, dressed as a girl. You know, playing dodgeball, playing basketball, playing baseball, not easy to perform, you know, wearing a skirt. Mm-hmm. So during the day, I felt like I was so socialized as a girl because I'm dressing as one, I'm getting called as one. And then at night, as soon as I got home, I'm throwing those jumpers off, I'm getting in my boy clothes, I'm playing with my boys in the neighborhood. And there I really feel like I'm living as a boy. Yeah. And my parents were very generous in allowing that to happen, you know, after hours. I felt very supported by them in that way. Yeah. But again, they grew up in a time, they have no resource for thinking about this. They're not going to think about it any differently. Yeah. Why would they? Yeah. So yes, they would know the term tomboy. I don't remember my parents ever using that of me. Yeah. But they were pretty gender expansive in the home space. Okay. But I think they felt when I was out in the world that I needed to conform to those expectations. So, for example, going to birthday parties. Mm-hmm. So here you're going to a birthday party, which is all about celebration. You're going to play all these games, and I am literally there in a party dress, you know? And the reason why I know that my mom must have had some tender feeling towards me is she would buy me these dresses. Maybe I wouldn't get into anything else. She'd buy me these dresses that would have like little sailor insignia. You know, so they'd have like a really girly skirt or whatever, but they'd have like a little sailor anchor or something, you know. And one dress, which was this green dress jumper, it had a sword on the belt, and she called that outright my sword dress, you know. So I was never quite sure, you know, whether I was armed against the world or it was like a weapon wounding me or whatever it was. But so I think those things are also very profound for children. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got the words which are encasing you, literally like a cone lowered on your body from birth. You're not even conscious yet. You haven't said a word. You don't know how to speak a language. It's going to take years to come into the language and culture. But it's like you wake up already in this oxygen tent breathing, you know, the oxygen of that word. Yeah. And you can see there's another word, only one other word, and you're not that. So the profound nature of it is, beyond belief.
Wow. You know, and that actually reminds me. So you, I'm going to read this from your book, Genders. You say, while a child is building a basic body image, learning that its body has some kind of borders in space and time, and sensing through its senses, we are fortifying what it can't see or feel. A gender we're invested in, built around a sex that the baby doesn't know. Yeah. And that was, I mean, that is the limiting, that what we were talking about earlier, is just this limiting way of viewing gender, and that we're forcing babies right when they're born. Yes. Right when they're born. Yes. Even before they're born. Right. Gender reveals and all sorts of different things that we do before to celebrate gender in these binary ways. Right. That there is no other option. Right. And that, to me, I never really thought of that. I never really thought of that because it just was.
Right. Right. And people say, you know, it's common sense. I find that common sense, and you can see it in this time period, since our government is saying they're going to be the common sense government. Common sense is usually a phrase people use to stop an argument. When they have nothing else to say, when they have no good argument to give, they just deem something common sense. Now, we could say, obviously, some people profoundly believe in the biological difference of male and female, right? And they feel like that determines everything. And we are now, again, by current government, we now are our genitals, right? So we're being told we are, I mean, that just seems amazing that people aren't fighting back and saying, oh, I'm not reducible to my genitals. And then somebody's going to say, oh, well, we're not reducing you to your genitals. Well, then what is the definition? So what's interesting, right, is the definition of man and woman, boy and girl, is being anchored to genitals.
Yeah.
But then the next question to ask is, all right, well, then what difference does that make? And then that's where nobody wants to go, because they really can't go there. They cannot come up with a reliable, watertight definition of boy, girl, man, woman. So the sort of going back to genitals is an attempt to sort of anchor it,
right,
and put the question to bed.
Scientific or it's
right.
biological.
It sounds like it's scientific and biological,
Yeah.
and of course it's not, in the sense that we know there are 5 layers of fetal sex, as I try to explain in the book. So we've got chromosomes, gonads, fetal hormones, internal reproductive structures. I always say, can you name the 3 for women and the 3 for men? Most people can't get all 6. And then the external genitals, which is really the one layer that we see at birth. And we lower that cone based on one of 5 fetal layers. And these fetal layers sometimes maybe not so, unusually.
They're different. They work
disagree with
differently
each other.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, I think the people who take a biological approach, a strictly biological approach, sometimes will say that they believe in brain sex. So that's a sort of concept. Somebody like Anne Fausto Sterling, who's an amazing scientist and studies sort of cultures of science, has kind of called that phrase more of a meme. That, it's sort of, I think, a notion that comes in the 1950s and then isn't really necessarily questioned by many people after that. The idea that the fetal hormones release a hormone that then just makes you a boy or a girl. Well, there's no real evidence of that.
Yeah.
And even if there are some biological differences in terms of brain, it's about a 70% overlap in brains between, say, boy brain, girl brain, man brain, woman brain. But it's not clear at all that brain size or brain weight leads to any cognitive differences, any behavioral differences. So even people who will say, okay, there's some brain differences to attend to here, have not been able to prove that those differences then lead to any reliable differences in terms of cognition and behavior. And last thing I'll say about this, though I think we'll probably say more, obviously we wouldn't need the concept of gender or the idea that, read this book, The Art of Being a Girl, or Fascinating Womanhood, or any of the, we wouldn't need those things. If sex just unfolds naturally, then you can't fail to be that sex. So it's very interesting, all these fortifying procedures that we go through, which, by the way, have differed tremendously over time. The definition and norms for women in my grandmother's time, to my mother's time, to me, and all 3 of us have worn the sign woman, are wildly different, from my grandmother, born in 1904, to, my being alive in this moment.
Yeah.
So that's pretty telling as well. Where's the natural biological unfolding? If this is simply a fact of nature and not a fact of culture, then why all these differences that we've seen over time?
Why would we need that much cultural reinforcement?
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
In your book, you write that gender is queer.
Yes.
What does that word mean?
Okay.
What is queer? Can you unpack that?
Because I think in this moment, people think of the word queer as an identity marker, right? So being an English professor, I always say, let's go to the dictionary. And the dictionary is very helpful in this way, because one meaning of queer is tied. In fact, I've got kind of an old school dictionary, that I had when I was a student in graduate school. And that one says derisive term for homosexual.
Oh, okay.
I love that because it shows that the word queer, at the time of that dictionary, obviously linked to homosexuality and considered a derisive term. Now, you and I know the derision is falling off because queer people use the word queer.
Yep.
Anybody can use the word queer of me as a queer person. But it's the second dictionary definition that is really important to me and to queer theory generally. And that's simply the word strange. And if we start opening that up, that's the word that queer theory often uses to turn assumptions on their head. So I would say that, in the time of sort of gay and lesbian theory, that as gay people, we were trying to prove to people, see, we're just like you. We're just as good as you are. We're just as moral. We're good, tax-paying, denizens of the United States, blah, blah, blah. Give us our rights. And queer theory turns that on its head to say, it's not that we gay people are just like you straight people. It's that you straight people are as strange as we are. We're all queer. So it takes that word out of the identity realm and actually spreads it across the scene of something like sexuality or childhood or gender, to say that we're all sort of caught inside these words. We're all struggling inside them, trying to move with them. Whatever it is we're doing, it's a very strange circumstance that we have on our hands.
Yeah. So that does break that you called it the sort of those constructs that are forced onto us, that cone. It kind of breaks it with just the word queer, saying that we all are strange.
Yes.
We all embody strangeness in some way.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is, and I do say this in my genders book, is that if you think about it, some of the most conventional notions of gender are the strangest ones. I would say it strikes me as very strange to create two different types of human beings from birth. Almost like you take a sword and you cut a human being in half, and this half will be boys and this half will be girls. And then their whole job in life is to find their missing half, the half that they're missing.
That's right, yeah, marriage
because,
or relationships.
Yeah, because these have to be exclusive definitions by the notion of opposite sexes. Yeah. So you take two people and then raise them as opposites and get them to believe that they're opposite of each other, and then imagine that the whole goal is to marry an opposite and then think together, love together, and raise little opposites. I would call that conventional idea that has been so much with us, certainly in the culture probably that you and I know, in terms of an American culture. That just strikes me as extraordinarily odd as a concept. So it's not even that everybody is sort of strange in relationship to normativity. It's that the very things that are given to us as normative are incredibly strange the more you think about them.
That's right. It is.
Yeah.
It is. And it kind of goes against what you were saying, the natural way of being. It goes against those natural ways of being, because we're having to really contort ourselves to fit some of these norms.
Yes.
And that of its own is a strange thing to go do.
Yes, and I think, in raising children, so many wonderful parents are rightfully telling their children, you can grow up to be anything you like. If you want to be a combat person, or you want to be a doctor, or you want to, be a nurse, or whatever it is, you're probably telling your child that all these avenues are open to them, in terms of their interests and things that they can be. And look at the changes, again, for women, taking that category, the changes from my grandmother's time to now, right, would be that I could aspire to be anything in the world. Now, whether I can actually achieve that, if I want to be a race car driver or whatever, that may be. But so we're telling children on the one hand, you can be anything. But then we're telling them, yes, but you are anchored to your genitals. So you can only be this or that.
Right.
And then, of course, the child would be logically asking, well, then what's the difference? If I can be anything, then what difference are genitals making?
Right.
Right. One thing I'll say about my own story that I didn't say before that may be helpful for people to hear, I know for a fact that for me, it was not about the body, meaning as a little boy child, boy aspiring child, I wanted the word. I did not want a penis. I didn't really know what you could do with such a thing. I had seen them. I had a brother. I had my boyfriend. We looked at each other's genitals. There was nothing there that I just felt like, oh, if I could only have that body part. I could see that you had to have the body part to get the word, and therefore be able to present with the surface.
Yeah.
But the actual genital was not of interest to me. And I think that's important to understand in all of this. I wanted the cultural word, that I did not perceive had to be anchored by genitals, because I felt absolutely like a boy and could play baseball like boys and, do all the other things.
Yeah.
So that may be important for us too, this strange moment of taking us back to our genitals, which again, not that many people are going to see. It's been a fairly limited people in my lifetime that have seen my genitals. Everybody else is going on faith, right?
Right.
So think about that. The whole point is to wear clothing to cover our genitals so they will not see them, but then we're asked to rehearse our genitals on our clothing.
That's it. That's true.
And why are we so interested in children's genitals and making children tied to their genitals? If you really think about that, that sounds, again, very odd.
Yeah, at birth.
At birth.
Before birth.
At birth.
What do you think happens when queer gender questioning kids are seen either too early, or is that even a thing? And this is an interesting question because I have friends that are raising young, 4-year-old, 5-year-olds who are now at this moment not questioning, but asking questions about their gender identity. Why can't I wear a dress when I go to school?
Right.
Why does she get to wear pink?
Yes.
Even now,
yes.
Pink is for, my son once came home and he said, I really like the color purple, but I can't. And I'm like, well, why? And he's like, because only girls can like purple or pink. And I was just like, whoa. And he's in preschool. And I'm like, where did you learn that?
Yes.
And it wasn't necessarily taught to him, but the way the school was structured, just the classroom itself, signified something in him to say that's not something I can do.
Right.
So okay, so I say all that to say, what happens when questioning kids are seen too early or not seen at all? And then, I guess let's start there.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, the one part of that equation we sort of talked about, like what is the damage of not seeing a child who's sort of crying out that this doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah.
And I think, it must be so hard for people to understand because clothing just seems so variable, right? You can take it off, you can put it on. Racialized skin, generally you cannot. I mean, you could use lightening creams, you could do things, but skin seems more permanent than clothing. Yes. I also point out that for many of us, clothing was like sewn to the bone cloth skin. Meaning when you put me in this thing, I feel like you have encased me in a skin where I cannot even recognize myself. I cannot tell you how much I need to be in these clothes rather than those clothes. So again, that runs very deep, and we sort of talked about the damage to children who can't be seen for wanting or needing something else. Now, the flip side of that you're asking is, too many people rushing in and making decisions about what this means. My child wants to wear a skirt. Oh, my Lord, do I need to change my entire conception of who this child is? And, maybe. But maybe not. This may be, why can't I wear something that somebody else has the right to wear? And notice the deep asymmetry for boys and girls. I think this is also a really interesting question. I could wear pretty much any type of men's clothing. I mean, I am.
I'm wearing men's pants.
Right. And, I go everywhere in suits and, sometimes people will remark or make notice. But in other words, it's not the same thing as if one of my male colleagues tomorrow, with a beard and short hair just starts wanting to wear a pink miniskirt to school. That's going to be very different because women have been granted this latitude going back to kind of early 20th century, post-World War I, when trousers and, dungarees came in for women and they had been overseas and working as, helping with ambulances and things like that. So latitude for women broadened. But for men, it largely hasn't. It's changed a bit over time, but it's still so asymmetrical. So for the boy to say, I want to wear the pink dress, is actually very different for a girl now to say, I want to wear those pants in a T-shirt, right? So in a very strange way, things are so constrained and limited for boys that it must be very confounding for boys at a certain age to feel, why is that off limits to me? Why can't I maybe even want to feel pretty? But the whole wish to feel pretty also, generally, off limits, a big old warning sign, right? So in that sense, who knows what it means? And I think maybe for the curious parent, the tender parent, it is to watch and listen and try to allow your child that latitude that makes them feel good, that makes them feel that they're things in the world and choices to make in terms of surface presentation, and not to assign too many words or too many concepts to
we're so
it,
quick
right?
to do that.
Exactly. Hold that loosely. I think the child will tell you, especially if you are a trusted collaborator with their surface look, as parents are, very much that, right? You're out there buying the clothes. They're not there, forking over the money to buy them. So you're involved. But listening to see what they might say and allowing yourself to hold these things loosely and not to assign them, big, deep-seated meaning until a big, deep-seated meaning is being presented to you.
Yeah, so pace it a bit and,
I think
and just
so.
kind of follow your child's lead.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying it is without complication, because I can imagine for many parents, the question comes in, so say your assigned boy child says they want to start wearing, that pink miniskirt to school every single day. I know a lot of parents are then going to have a worry about that, right? Because then they're going to be saying, well, am I allowing damage to come to my child by allowing that?
You mean like bullying? Or,
yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Just worry about what that could mean.
Yeah, in
for
more
who people
way.
will start thinking your child, sees themselves as, and so forth. So I'm not saying that these are all just, completely easy. Just be curious, just be tender. I know there's a lot of difficult territory in there, but I think the very first step is that listening, watching, being curious yourself, but kind of just waiting to see what they're saying, what they're expressing. Yeah. I think children, given the space to do that and feeling there's a loving receptor on the other end, are pretty darn good at that.
I really like that advice to just follow your child's lead in this because and I also like that you acknowledge that it is complex.
Right.
And that there are other things that that could be layered underneath all of this for parents to start categorizing or start doing the research and that's interesting too, because the access to resources are just so different now.
Yes.
There are lots of kids books around gender identity.
Yes.
And
creative parenting.
And conscious parenting.
Yes.
And so parenting has changed so much. It's almost even going to this place where there's just a lot of information. And so we are trying to grasp onto anything to try, because we were brought up in very categorical, nice, neat constructs, right? That we're trying to break.
Right.
And now we're moving into parenting, which is a little bit more fluid, which is a little bit more nuanced. And we're still trying to grasp onto things and say, okay, well, this is what it must be. So then this is what we need to do in order to be good parents. And we're navigating a lot.
Right. And I think the problem is also if we lock ourselves inside words again. So this is probably strange to hear coming from me, since I so desperately wanted that term boy. But again, that was also a navigation of what the term girl meant, right? Because those things are in locked relationship to each other. So over time, as terminology changes, right, different contents are going to shift, the possibilities of words, even what surface forms look like. One of the things that I would really hope for is that there will be, and I think this is starting to be, tremendous latitude in the surface presentation of bodies. Then that itself will spawn new, kind of fanciful terms. Sometimes I call myself, a dandy butch. Well, that's just kind of a made-up phrase for myself, right? I hold it loosely. I think it's funny. I kind of like it. But in other words, maybe we would all learn in some ways that there are going to be certain words we love and we gravitate towards, who knows why, and certain surface presentations. But those may change over time. We're probably going to have more, say, men, again, I'm taking like a bearded man, wearing beautiful eyeliner, maybe even lipstick. Maybe that's going to be a look that we come to love and cherish and many people will gravitate towards, In my time period, if you told me the guys would be dyeing their hairs, and actually wearing form-fitting suits and be allowed to care about their watches and their socks and their shoes, I would have said, wow, don't see that coming for straight men. Yeah. But, here we are. So that's the thing, too, for parents is the ground in history is always changing underneath you. And we have to keep that in mind as we go as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of reckoning within ourselves to sort of, you know, what I mentioned earlier is the undoing that I had to do or continue to do. I think that would be key in order for me to even understand.
Yes.
Even to follow my child's lead. I would need to let go of a lot of things that I held on to so tightly and didn't even know I held on to it until I was confronted by it with my child.
Yes. And I think reading history too, this sounds funny again because we're talking about going forward and what's going to happen in the future. But knowing history and knowing the past is critical to actually opening things up and realizing that things were not always this way. Again, people seem to kind of lock it in, like people thinking marriage was always one man, one woman. Well, not true. And not true that people always married for love. That's about as recently as, the late 18th century. And one of the things that I take so seriously in my genders book is the history of race in the United States, right? That we can see going back to the 13 colonies, I would say we've always had at least 6 sexes in these United States from the founding of the nation. Meaning that in that time period, legal distinctions were being made and presumed biological distinctions between and among white man, white woman, native woman, black man, black woman, and then sort of other sexes and other territories. So if you think about it, U.S. racial history is the proof against there ever having been opposite sexes in the United States. There have never been men and women yet in the history of these United States. And, sometimes people say, well, intersectionality, we don't like that word. We don't like what that implies and try to keep that word from being spoken at universities or other places. But I always say, who believes in intersectionality? Every single U.S. politician. They're the ones that when it comes to voting and reaching out to different groups, how are Latinas voting? That's different than black women, which is different than white men, which is, right? So there's the proof that when people want something and need something out of other human beings,
they have to look at the intersectional identities, and especially if you're trying to sway a population opinion.
Exactly. So intersectionality is profoundly believed in by pretty much every politician I've ever met or talked to.
Yeah.
No matter how much they might be against intersectionality in other contexts and other discursive domains.
Well, speaking of that, how has gender evolved?
Yeah.
In terms of conversations around it.
Yes.
Because it seems that we've progressed quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But then we've also regressed because of even current political climate and our current administration.
Yep.
Like it's just been we're going way back.
Yes.
How has conversations changed around gender now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just kind of stick with maybe the last, 15 years or something. And I just think, actually, I'm going to go back to the time that you and I together were in Office for Equity and Diversity, because in that setting, things were just starting to change. I think you noticed it, I noticed it. Our student groups, right, say Black Student Union or Asian American Student Association, the students themselves were starting to kind of come to this understanding of intersectionality, not using the word.
When was that word coined?
Well, the word is coined 1989, okay. So it goes back quite a ways. But it's a term Kimberly Crenshaw, legal expert, was using it to try to talk about sex and race discrimination in the workplace and what that meant for Black women who were experiencing both. So it's a term that is needed to really address a very practical legal issue. And then the term sort of takes off in theoretical and academic circles. But when I came into that job in 2014, since Asian American Student Association is not, fully a group of people studying, gender and ethnic studies, they were studying, everything. They're in physics or whatever. But they themselves were starting to say like, hey, yes, we are similar to each other in terms of Asian American background in some ways, but wow, the difference for you as a man than for me as a woman, and hey, I'm trans or I'm queer. These differences were sprouting up inside the student groups. They were becoming finally attentive to these differences and were finding ways to speak about them, as people do, not needing any fancy academic terms to describe them. And I remember talking to, some of our great colleagues who were advisors to the groups, and they were coming and saying, hey, this conversation is breaking out. Like, what do you think? And what should we do? And I was saying, that's so interesting to hear. So that's 2014. And then, as you know, as my communications person, I was getting asked to go all around the university and give a diversity talk. And my standard answer to that was, I don't do a diversity talk, but I'll come and give you a theory talk if you want one. And then people were just too embarrassed to disinvite me, so I still got to go. You saw some of those talks. And in those talks, it was just so interesting to see what people did not understand. And one of the things that people were very curious about and wanted to hear me talk about and would just admit, I don't understand this at all, but it would be so helpful to hear you talk about it, trans issues. So that's an indication, that at least in our environment, in an equity and diversity environment, and I don't think that was so true for the VP before me. I don't think, those questions were sprouting up as dramatically when he would be out speaking. So I was starting to address those. And I remember one of the handouts that I had would be the 7 different categories at, Mount Holyoke University, Mount Holyoke College, Women's College, that they had to create all these new categories to be able to address the issue of whether trans women and trans men could be admitted to a historic women's college. And part of what I was pointing out to the audience is, who doesn't know who a woman is anymore? The historic women's colleges. Think about that. That's mind-blowing, right? So I'd say, early 2010s, these issues are starting to sprout up among people. And just anecdotally, as I walked in the world, I just go to a yoga retreat and be trying to have a little peace in a corner, and somebody comes and finds me and says, I need you to talk to so-and-so because their daughter is saying that they're not their daughter. And so it started happening that wherever I went, people were needing to talk about these issues. So I'd say for me, that's when I was really seeing that happen. And that was just a couple of years after my Queer Child book, came out. And so I thought there was a lot of curiosity. Things were showing up in the press. The New York Times was getting involved. And I'm not saying there was always great stuff showing up in the press, a lot of misinformation or kind of mangled, explanations of things. But I felt a sense of curiosity and openness. And then, of course, I think what we saw, I would say post-George Floyd, first of all, the tremendous fear that there could actually be a racial reckoning in this country, that maybe one was going to get going. And the people who feared that found a way to shut that down, with the whole business about critical race theory and trying to demonize that. And then I think that worked so well. I don't even know whether they knew that was going to work so well. I don't know if they were just throwing spaghetti at the wall. Then I think, kind of evil genius thinking, well, what could work even better? The question of the gender and sexuality of your child, because they could see that there was an opening, an embrace, new words being coined, right? People identifying in new ways, being allowed to present in new ways. And the fear factor jumped right up. And now they're going to go, it's the question of talking. So that those who talk about issues of gender and sexuality.
Are your books banned?
Probably not banned, maybe not yet. I don't know. Maybe in some places they would be. But the sheer act, if we were, working in the elementary school or secondary education, we would be the pedophiles. We would be the groomers for simply admitting that there are gay and trans children in our midst and wanting to have a loving embrace of those children, which to my mind does absolutely zero damage to any other child, to see other children actually embraced for who they may feel themselves to be. So there's, I think, the change. I would put post-George Floyd, interestingly, as a key pivot point in this move against gender and sexuality, because I think it followed as a corollary, that if we're going to try to shut down conversation about race, and I don't know what anybody else would say, and this will be too simplistic, but I'll give it, the election that we just had felt very much like an identity politics election, but identity politics in terms of men, right? And you could say white men, but there was an interesting move to say, we are a colorblind society now. We're going to be colorblind, hence no DEI, can't teach ethnic studies. We don't want you teaching race or African-American history because that messes up the whole idea of a colorblind society. So we're going to be colorblind in terms of race, but we are going to reestablish that absolute, firm, and undeniable natural boundary between men and women.
Yeah.
And that's why you can't have gender studies. So for one reason, you can't have ethnic studies.
Right.
And for the other reason, you can't have gender studies.
Right.
For two opposite reasons.
And there is
that go together.
An interesting masculine redefinition of masculinity and what that looks like.
Yeah.
And we have our young kids watching this and also just another reinforcement. Again, another added cone, which I think that cone was always there, but there's something else in the air with that.
Yeah. And even, among left-leaning, liberal, embracing people. So I think of somebody like Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU, works on business and different things. A very intelligent human being and has a podcast with Kara Swisher, The Pivot. And Scott Galloway is sort of championing this question of, boys in trouble. And I don't actually take issue with that. I think we should be attentive to any category of human being that is struggling and try to figure out what those things are. However, I find him interesting because what he's saying is that the problem on the left is they will only talk about toxic masculinity, and then they basically say that men need to be more like women. So he then is trying to come up with this new definition of masculinity that I think he calls it aspirational masculinity. I could be getting that wrong, but something like that. And what he gives as a sort of, aspiration, what should be the aspiration for young men now, particularly young men who want to get with, young women, is to be protective, intelligent, and kind. That he says this is what young women want from young men. Now look at that definition. So then that's the new, non-toxic masculinity, but, masculine definition. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't hold any water. Are women not protective, intelligent, and kind? Yeah. So I don't see how you're going to differentiate anything from anything. In fact, I would just say he just gave a definition of masculinity that would make men be more like women, and yay for that, right? Because again, those are characteristics that not just that women can have, but I'd say all three of those categories are in some ways almost central to the sort of made-up definition of femininity, which is to say, if you think of protective, who's more protective than mothers, right? Or mothers are equally protective as fathers. It would be absurd to say that men are protective in some way that women aren't at this point in time.
That's right.
Right? So that makes no sense. Intelligent, even he would have to admit that women are highly intelligent. He works with one, Kara Swisher. And kindness, again, that's almost a stereotypical feminine trait. Mm-hmm. So sometimes in my class, I have students write down the deepest stereotypes they can think of for masculine and feminine. And then we find out, first of all, do we know lots of women who are those things and lots of men who are those things? Yeah, so they absolutely overlap just in terms of the human beings who occupy the categories. But even if you look at the categories, say take one like obedient, right, which we'd say, okay, maybe that's a stereotypical feminine thing, dependent and obedient. Well, think of obedience. That is definitional to who soldiers are. Soldiers are meant and made to obey in the strongest way possible. So you could say that obedience is absolutely at the center of the definitional core of a certain aspect of masculinity that associates with the military, right? So this
you can poke a lot of holes.
Yes, or if you take bravery, which again, say we associate that with men, or we think men would rush into a burning building or whatever. Well, the bravest thing I have ever heard tell of, and I haven't done it, but you may know some people who have.
Are you talking about giving
wink.
birth?
I'm talking about a live human being coming out of your most private pig parts. Yes. I consider that to be the bravest thing I have ever heard tell of.
He's brave.
Yes. So frightening, I could never possibly do it. So these are the problems that you find these people who are making sometimes intelligent, meaningful, empathetic moves to say, let's see why boys are struggling. Yes, many white boys have had a lot of privilege. Not all white boys have. I take that very seriously. But then I can't find anybody who can intelligently create a definition that works. So if we can't find any definitions that will hold water, what does that tell us about this complete obsessive, immersion we have in imagining that the child from birth has to have the cone lowered as boy or girl, and never shall thou leave the cone, I mean,
right.
Yeah.
It literally is scripture. It feels that way.
Yes.
Wow, yeah. Well, I mean, I could keep going. There's so many questions. There's so many things.
Let's just have a weekend retreat,
I'm down.
Podcast. Yeah.
I'm down. But my last question, to wrap it up, I just want to, I want to leave some parents, caregivers, educators, something to hold on to when they're thinking about raising or caretaking children at whatever age.
Yes.
I really like your advice on letting the child lead the way. What are some other things that maybe you would advise, or maybe open the eyes of some of these caregivers and parents too, that might be helpful?
I think it's related to something you said earlier, which I think was so important, almost right from the start. Looking into yourself, the type of learning that you've received. Where has this learning come from? Where has it gotten us? Yes. Yeah. What of the things that we were told ever proved to be true? I have not been able to find one thing about what I was told about boys and girls, men and women, other than how some babies are made sometimes. Other than that, I cannot think of one thing that I was told in my whole life, that turned out to be true. So I think this means ourselves getting educated, getting re-educated, examining our own lives. Where have our thoughts come from? What's our own investment in our own surface presentation? I mean, hopefully we all like the way that we're presenting. That's a big privilege in life to be able to do that, right? We all have our thoughts about our bodies, or, whatever that might be. But I think that deep-seated looking into your own life and kind of opening up what gender has been for you, what are your own investments, may tell you a lot. So I think we all think about looking at the child and focusing on the child and trying to figure out what's going on there. And again, that really gentle listening is so good. But I think looking into oneself, and I think that's something, that as a white person, I learned from a very early age with whiteness, right? That this is going to be a lifelong examination of this thing, a lifelong struggle with this thing of what that word has meant on my body and what I'm going to do with that. So I think that's a big part of it, is making that examination. With a lot of love and interest, talking to friends, seeing what other people think. People who are open to have that conversation can be so illuminating. I think it's fun. It
is, and especially when you're doing it together with other people. I mean, I think that's been really great for me to connect with my siblings. You know them.
Yes.
Each one of us are questioning not just gender, what we were taught, but culturally, family norms and dynamics and rules that we never fully understood but abided. Things that we're really trying to unlearn or at least understand, and it's gonna take a lifetime, because I do believe it's generational. I do believe, even when we're talking about gender and gender identity, you're talking about how different it's looked across generations, and also just even the labeling and the words, how that's evolved. We've held on to so much that we're undoing a lot of that as well in this moment. And so I think that's been really
And for myself, I try not to fear, talking with people who are going to have a very different idea. I'm trying to seek that out.
You do. You do. I know this about you. This I know very much. And
again, I don't know where that impulse comes from, but I feel I do want to reach out to people, and I want to invite people to move towards these questions. And sometimes the only way to do that is to go into settings where people are hearing very different things. Could put my hair on end, but to try to meet people and to say, really would like to hear how you're thinking about that. Tell me what that means for you. And the last thing I'll say about that, this is an ethic I'm really trying to abide by, and it's not easy, but I think you know this too from things I've said, that when I, am encountering a human being, I'm really trying to see that body as form, color, vibrancy, sound, and try not to start projecting words onto that body. Very hard to do because I'm a sighted person. So my sight is firing off words as to what I think I'm seeing. And I'm really trying to stop myself, almost have a good discussion with myself and say, well, that's what you think you're seeing, but we do not know. So let us listen. Really, the radical encounter, if I meet you somewhere and I don't know yet anything about you, I see a wonderful human being, and now I'm listening for the words that you use. And then
letting me inform sort of an identity.
Yeah. And this is the thing that gets us out of kind of really strong identity-driven stuff, which I always say I'm tender towards identities but suspicious of them, because they are ultimately words and concepts. So that if I see you, now I'm starting to hear some of the words you associate. I hear what pronouns. I just hear whatever. But the bigger mystery and fun of it is going to be entering into narrative. So let's say you rattle off a bunch of words just, as I'm getting to know you, I'm listening to what those words are. Now really the job is to see what's the context of those words in your life. How has your life pivoted around those terms? What do they mean to you? How have you lived them? Have you struggled with any of them? Do you love them? Is there one that you've always worn? Like for me, whiteness is always going to be a word that there's like an ick factor of thinking of identifying with it, but I'm struggling with it. I'm wrestling with it. I'm definitely confessing it, that I have a long-standing history with it. So those are some of the things that I think we could take on as a potential radical commitment, which is really to sever surface from depth. Here's the surface that I see. I'm going to glory in that. And I have no idea what goes on behind your eyes, the thinking, the life story, what pools behind your eyes, consciously or unconsciously. And the great thing is that's inexhaustible. You and I can, I hope, know each other all our lives, and that narrative is never going to be at an end surrounding those key terms and words and contexts.
I love what you said about severing the surface from depth.
Yes.
Very good. Very good.
And of course, the last big thing I'll say is surface is deep. And that's sometimes the thing that we tend to have this idea that surface is shallow and that, depth is deep. But I think one thing that I always say to parents is, you can come to me with your struggles and tell me what you're struggling with your child. I can hold that for you. And it's great for your child not to hear some aspects of that. That will not help them. And sometimes parents will say to me, but oh my God, I'm just going to miss, I thought this was a girl. And now to see a different, look is just kind of killing me. And I say, well, let that be your guide. Because what you did, understandably, was to attach to that surface so deeply.
Right, and you're in the process of severing now.
Yes,
or
and that's kind of the clue to what your child is telling you. Yeah. You're confessing that surface is deep. And that's exactly what your child is saying when they say they need to make this surface change. That's the one thing over and over that I find parents, like a little light bulb going off, like, oh my goodness. Really like the depth of my grief over this, potentially my grief, can be the very key to my understanding this incredibly important thing that my child is saying and doing.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll just do a second. We'll do another episode.
Yeah, we can go off and collect, questions that people have about what we said.
That's
or
true.
Challenges.
That's true. That'd be great. Yeah.
And say, hey, when you said that, Stockton,
what does that
I was
mean?
not with you.
Yeah.
Explain yourself.
Yeah, we'll open it up. And I will link all of these books as well to this episode. But I just thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I adore you. I love you. I appreciate you. So thank you.
Back at you 100-fold.